Good evening and good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vincia Cloete. I'm the Executive Director of the Namibia Institute of Corporate Governance. Welcome back to Fireplace Conversations. And tonight, we're talking about from shareholder-centric to stakeholder-inclusive governance. What does that mean? What does this denote? I have with me a very clued up panel of three, and I'm just going to introduce them, starting with Mrs. Louise Shixwameni. She's a decorated academic who holds numerous achievements in various fields, including a PhD studies at Wits University, specializing in strategy and leadership, which she is still pursuing on a part-time basis, master's degree in administration from UNAM, a degree in administration from UNAM, a postgraduate diploma in management consulting from UK, an advanced diploma in business administration from Kenya, a certified business process management expert, and a certified balance scorecard expert. Her professional career includes working for various institutions like, for instance, presently with the Ministry of Public Enterprises as the deputy, well, not permanent secretary anymore, but deputy executive since 2017. Office of the Prime Minister as a Director of Performance Management from 2015 to 27, and a lot of other accolades and career that she has had that we really can't go in right now because it's really long, and you can already tell that she's a seasoned specialist in her field. She's a professional career. Her professional career journey includes multi-skills experience and broad exposure in the public and private sector, and she's a reputable expert in corporate governance, by the way, strategic business planning and balanced scorecard, something we spoke about last week, and transformational leadership, performance management, training development, and corporate communication. Mrs. Shixwameni is also an activist and motivational speaker and a passionate community and traditional leader. And she was appointed as one of the youngest senior traditional counselor and advisor to the King of Ondonga. I will leave it there. And she's saying, please. And I have with me Ms. Mercia Geises. She's an experienced business leader in financial services with a broad knowledge and experience in retail and corporate services. She's been a Chief Executive Officer of Standard Bank Namibia since 2021. She started her career in law, so she's a lawyer, and she is being in the financial services where she grew from various specialist roles into a corporate executive. She's responsible for retail banking franchise, the largest division in the bank, which includes personal markets, branch networks, business banking with a headcount of over 1,000 employees. She's born and raised in Namibia, and she's an admitted legal practitioner, B Juris at UNAM, LLB and LLM Mercantile Law from the University of Free State, and an MBA from the Stellenbosch University, also a Mati. And before joining Standard Bank, she's worked at Old Mutual for 12 years, rising to the position of CEO of Old Mutual Investment Group Namibia. She lives in Namibia, and yeah. Mr. Mark Dawe, I hope I say that right because I had to practice that before getting on set. He's the Managing Director and the Country Manager for B2Gold Namibia, position he's held since February 2015. He was previously employed as a Vice President, Key Raw Materials and Head of Mining Operations for Solvay's Global Business Unit, Special Chemicals. And in this role, he was responsible for overseeing the mining operations and projects of the unit, including the Okorusu fluorspar mine in Namibia, which also includes Oshikoto's, like it's in the Oshikoto area, I think. Yeah. So Mark has worked in Namibia for over 30 years, and he's literally like a Namibian right now. And he's told me before the set that he is actually African. I had thought that he wasn't, but he's actually African. He has an extensive technical background, including an extensive extractive metallurgy degree and M-Science degree in hydrogeology. That was almost a mouthful for me. Mark has keen interest in environmental protection, conservation, and corporate social responsibility, and that ties very well into the topic that we have today. So we're just going to go straight to our topic, and I hope you're all relaxed and you're ready to have this conversation. I want you to have a conversation with us, and we're really interested to hear your personal views from your experience rather than, theoretical information, as it were. So I want to start basically with you, Mercia, and just I'm putting you on the spot like that, but let's start with you, just distinguishing for us what is a shareholder and what is a stakeholder, because I think people would like to know that difference before we go from, the topic that we have in terms of shareholder primacy to stakeholder-centric or stakeholder-inclusive governance.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Vincia, and thank you to the Institute of Corporate Governance for hosting this and for having us here tonight. It's quite a privilege to be engaging on something so fundamental. When you talk about corporate governance and you talk about shareholders and stakeholders, you talk about them as if they are objects, but it's actually two very fundamental pillars that relate to human beings and human behavior. So shareholders, when you talk about shareholders, the primary word that I will use is ownership. When you talk about stakeholders, the primary word that I will use is either relationship or influence. And that's really the big difference between the two. And I've been so fortunate that throughout my career, I've worked for primarily listed entities. And as a result, many of the shareholders that I have worked with in my career have been investors, as opposed to shareholders in the sense of a family-owned business or shareholders in the sense of a privately owned entity. So there are also various types of shareholders that you find, but any organization really has a matrix of relationships. And business decisions are really choices on whom you want to relate to as a business. And those relationships are with customers, suppliers, partners, and various people that have an influence on the organization and the entity, as opposed to people that just have the ownership. So that would be the fundamental difference for me. And some of the world's biggest organizations have been able to attract talent, articulate ideas, and build strong brands, not because of financial value drivers only, but because they've been able to manage very, very strong relationships with stakeholders. So shareholders really about financial return and value, stakeholders really about brand positioning, and your ability to drive something that is a lot more integrated and connected to something outside of just ownership. So that would be the...
And just to add to that, stakeholders, and you've spoken about influence and branding and so on, can your stakeholders do they have only positive influence, or can it be stakeholders that have negative influence? Can they be stakeholders as well?
Yes.
Who do you consider?
So there are stakeholders that both can agree or not agree with what your company's purpose is, what your values are, and how you actually drive your business. And if they are negative stakeholders with negative influence, they need to be managed just as well as stakeholders that have got a positive or brand ambassador influence. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's good. I'm going to go to Louise. Would you tell us what is the shareholder-centric or shareholder primacy model of governance? And I think now we're moving towards a different model, but obviously there are still entities that practice this model of shareholder primacy in governance. What would be your view of that?
Okay, thank you so much once again for NICG for giving us an opportunity to discuss this pertinent question. I think corporate governance is becoming more and more important to every sphere of our life and business. And And I think this topic, it's very interesting because traditionally, especially for private sector and the businesses that Mercia has worked on, the approach was on shareholder approach in terms of you must work in the best interest of the shareholder. And the shareholder want the business and management to maximize shareholder values. But of course, as I think the world is emerging, a lot of businesses has realized that just maximizing on shareholders' value and the interest of the shareholder, who are the owners, like Mercia said, it is not going to sustain your business. And that's the reason why, for example, King 4 now, starting from King 3, King 4, and the OECD corporate governance guideline, then introduced a shift from a shareholders approach to an inclusive shareholder corporate governance approach. Of course, there are still businesses and there's still an online or ongoing world debate around, because, for example, there were what they called a shareholders corporate governance approach to an enlightened shareholders corporate governance approach, where usually shareholder will then say, okay, you must act in the best interest of the business, you must act in the best interest of the shareholder, but you should also take into consideration the views of the stakeholder, but as long as it's in the best interest of the shareholder. But now, recently, over the last 10 to 15 years, the focus has now changed to inclusive corporate governance, whether it's for a private business or whether for a public business. So therefore, in this approach, it says that the interest it's an approach that says that you must act in the best interest of the company, not in the best interest of the shareholder or stakeholders' view. In fact, the understanding in terms of corporate governance is that when you run a business, irrespective of the type of ownership, the interest of all concerned parties and their expectation should be at the table of the board of directors' decision making. So it's shifting the whole approach to say we are here to only serve the shareholder, but says, come on, who are your? Let's pose. Who are our key stakeholders? And almost all the key stakeholders that Mercia talked about, they are your stakeholders. So how about our investors, if you are a business? How about our creditors? How about our consumers? How about our institutional investors? How about the citizen? Because I read a case study, for example, of I think Pick n Pay in South Africa. I think it was 2 years ago, where they had a crisis about one of the customers who was sending mysterious notice to say, I've put on your shelf 3 poisoned products. At the beginning, the company actually tried to conceal it. And then when it became a public matter, there was an outcry and they lost almost 15 million. So the business then decided through the board of directors' decisions to say, now we're going to be transparent to all our stakeholders, and we're going to tell them exactly what this business is doing. And because of the interest they took into including the stakeholders into the businesses and into their products, then they gain more stakeholders support. And the reputation of the business is usually depend on not how the business is doing in maximizing the value of the shareholder, but in actually how the reputation of the stakeholders out there feel on that business. And that's why I think this approach, inclusive stakeholder corporate governance approach, is an important aspect of any business.
Yeah, so Mark, I actually want to come to you, and I think Ms. Louise has preempted my next question, which is very good because she's actually gone into, aspects of stakeholder inclusivity. And the backdrop of that for me is that, the recognition that a company or an organization is a legal entity and obviously owes its existence not only to the shareholder, but to other value-adding or value-creating stakeholders. What would you say should be the board's consideration? What should be the board's thinking when you're thinking of stakeholder inclusivity?
Well, I think the previous two speakers said it very well. There's not really that much I can add. I think Louise mentioned there that the board has been appointed by the shareholders. And it's the board's responsibility to take the company further, to make sure the company is doing as well as it possibly can. And if that means, as we now understand, including the stakeholders, as many of the stakeholders as possible, because as you said, you can have positive stakeholders and negative stakeholders, but if you don't take all of their opinions into consideration, they can both have a massive effect on the productivity of the business. And I think the great thing about the world in which we live today and governance today is that we moved away from profit at any cost, the profit at any cost model, to the triple Ps, the bottom line being profit, people, planet, people being right in the middle. I especially put it in the middle there. Some people put profit in the beginning, some people put it at the end. Doesn't matter where it is, but the point is that it's not just about profit. And if it is just about profit, then you lose your relevance in society. I come from the mining industry. I've always been in the mining industry. I think it's very clear to me that any business involved in mining is involved in the consumption of a national resource, right? The resource is owned by the people of the country, in our case, Namibia. And we definitely have a responsibility beyond our shareholders. Obviously, the shareholders have put up the money somehow. They've got the money there. But the responsibility to maximize the benefit to the country of that particular resource, in our case, could be different in banking, in your case, it could be different in different aspects of the economy, different sectors. But it's completely obvious that the migration towards an inclusive, stakeholder-centric, not at the exclusion of the shareholder, because at the end of the day, the shareholder has to be considered. That is the path towards the future, as far as I'm concerned. Many businesses today, whether it's in mining or elsewhere, still adopt the profit at any cost model. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the profit at any cost model as far as mining is concerned. There are even companies that are putting out a type of governance system that advocates profit at any cost. Where you have, I won't say the particular mining model, where you upfront all of your answers, you high grade the mine to make sure you maximize shareholder value upfront. But in doing so, what you're actually effectively doing is you're leaving a lot of the low grade gold, in our particular case, low grade ore, behind so that it's no longer sustainable to mine. So a significant part of the ore body is not being mined for the people of the country, for the benefit of the people of the country. Country's not benefiting from the entire resource. It's only benefiting from the massive profits that you're making in the beginning of the life of the mine, in our particular case. And, in my career before corporate governance became a common thing to talk about, I have, for whatever reason, not from any great sort of spring of knowledge that I have, or reservoir of knowledge, but I've always felt that an ore body has to be maximized. You've got to utilize the entire resource. And in order to do so, you've got to maximize benefits to everybody, including the stakeholders, of which the shareholders are also stakeholders, don't forget. So I think it's a fantastic progression, and the companies that haven't yet reached that stage, they've realized that it's not about the single P, profit, it's about the 3 Ps. They really need to move that way because they're going to become irrelevant. You spoke about King 4, and once again, I'm a practical person, I speak from a practical point of view. But the one thing that King 4 pushes is that, and Mervyn King, I've sat with him, had dinner with him, met him a couple of times through our mutual friend Steve Galloway. He's pushed the research that he's actually done in the past, which has led him to the belief that those companies that are fabulously successful, and sustainably so, the 100-year companies that have been around forever, there's only one lowest common denominator, one common factor of all those companies, and that is that they're relevant to their stakeholders. Right? They've made themselves relevant because they haven't concentrated on profit at any cost. Their social responsibility, we now call it social investment programs, we now call it ESG. Everything is in place, and they become relevant, they become liked by the stakeholders, by the communities in which they operate, and they can continue to operate successfully year after year after year. Otherwise, the other companies would be fabulously successful for a few years, lose their relevance because of negative stakeholders or public opinion or whatever it might be, and they collapse. They reach their pinnacle. Like civilizations often, they collapse because they lose their relevance. So I think we're all saying the same thing.
Yeah, I think so. And Mercia, I just want to go back to what you mentioned about profit at all costs. And I think it comes from the perspective that, you know, the company is the asset or the property owned by the shareholder. And you've mentioned that ownership aspect. And I think that's the backdrop to which the shareholder would say we should be considered primarily. I would like you to speak a little bit about shareholder interference in governance and just, you know, the aspects of shadow directorship.
Yeah, I think I've been very fortunate in my career that I've never experienced shadow directors. I think the closest I have come to that was when you work for a matrix organization and there are, for example, group people. So you work as part of a big multinational. And their group counterparts, and they would then think or want to make a decision in a place where they actually have no decision rights. That was the closest I've come to almost a shadow directorship position. But as a director of an entity, you need to just make sure that you continuously remind people that you cannot have the privilege of decision rights whilst you do not have the fiduciary duty and all the accountability and responsibility that comes with actually being a director of an entity. And it is for the directors to be very conscious and deliberately manage that agenda when they realize that there is a shadow director in play. It's to be assertive because you have the right to assert your fiduciary responsibility. So I've never had to really deal with a shadow directorship situation. And I think it is something that you find more commonly in the European jurisdiction and maybe in the US, but it's not something I've encountered in this part of the world.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I have experienced it in governance, but I just want to ask Louise, she's laughing because she needs to answer this one. How does this relate to public entities? Does, you know, because the shareholder is quite involved, how can you actually, what is that involvement? What is that interference like? And should we draw a line? Where should we draw that line?
Probably that question you shouldn't ask me. You should ask one of the board of directors that we are managing, because we are managing 81 public entities.
Yeah.
And we are, for example, for the commercial public enterprises, we are the direct shareholders of Telecom, Nampower, and others, Namport, Trust Namibia, you mentioned it. So I think if you ask one of the board of directors for Nampower or Namport whether there's a shareholder, shadow directors, they might answer. But the thing is that there's a perceived, there has been a perceived and maybe also real practice within the public sector in terms of maybe interference in terms of shareholder, and maybe there was not a clear, distinct definition in terms of what the shareholder does. So, and we always said, okay, I think for a very long time, government has not been an active shareholder, and they have not also maybe practiced their full shareholder role in terms of what corporate governance entails. But at the same time, after working in this industry for the last 5 years, I realized also that the problem was not government as a shareholder, was board of directors not understanding their fiduciary duties.
Okay.
So at times, if you ask the board of directors, whose interest do you serve? They say, I serve the interest of the shareholder.
Yeah.
So they forget that the world has moved on, that you serve the interest of the company. And a company is a juristic person, and you must protect the silent man or woman who's not talking in the boardroom. And that is the company. And I think because a lot of board did not have skills and understanding of their fiduciary duty, they bowed to political pressure. Because if they understood their fiduciaries, they would not bow to political pressure. And I think we have been appointing strong boards, and I've seen boards coming to the shareholder and says, shareholder, here you are crossing your boundaries. So we therefore we will engage you and will make you to understand, but we will not act with what is against the interest of the company. So I think in the public sector, our focus for the last few years was really about capacitating, first appointing competent board, capacitating the board members to understand their fiduciary duty, but also educating ourselves as the shareholder government to understand our role as a shareholder and to make sure that there is no interference. There is what we call intervention, but not interference. Because there are times where you need to intervene because, for example, there are businesses that are technically insolvent, they are relying on the state subsidy, and they are making wrong decisions. So as an interest who have put equity in that business, and yet maybe certain things are not happening. So as part of the stakeholder management, you call the board in and says, I think this is not the right direction we think the business should be going. But we are trying to do that now by making sure that when the board of directors are appointed, a business have a business plan, and all the discussion we're supposed to have takes place at business planning level. So once an integrated strategic business is approved, we let that business and the board of directors that we put in charge to go and run that business and provide the oversight, and then we would just provide the support that is required as a shareholder. And I think the trend is emerging to the positive way.
So you mentioned, I just quickly want to follow up on what you mentioned about political pressure or, political interference in a sense. When a board finds themselves in a situation, and now I'm talking about public entities, when they find themselves as directors in this position, what's the best thing to do? How should they go about resolving and making sure that the shareholder is not involved in the way they should not be, that they are not interfering, rather intervening?
Okay. First of all, if a board of directors understands their fiduciary duties, I mean, the public entities has a lot of intricacies, There's a lot of, like, for example, we have classified some public entities where they are a commercial entity, but they also have social objectives. So, and sometimes there's certain interaction and dialogue that has to take place between the shareholder and the board of directors and management on how to carry out this social mandate. But we have agreed that, of course, we'll have to fund this social mandate if it's a commercial entity. We do not expect a commercial entity to carry out a social mandate. That is not done. But now, sometimes the shareholder might be acting because they don't have information. So I think we take it for granted that stakeholder engagement and shareholder engagement, it's given. The board need to have strategic interventions around stakeholders' engagement. So if we only meet at the AGM, then you might expect that the shareholder might not understand. So what level does the board, what strategy does the board has in place to do stakeholder engagement? And sometimes also, like the shareholder from public, if it's a minister, the minister is acting on the interest of the citizen because the citizens are complaining that this company is not delivering, this company is doing this because the company is not managing its stakeholders. So, and it might be detrimental to the stakeholder, and it become now a national issue. And then the minister is saying, I'm just receiving calls from these communities, they are being affected in this way and this way. Now we are saying, okay, the minister is interfering. But it's because the board of directors do not have a strategy for inclusive stakeholder management.
Okay, I think that's important, because I wanted to actually go to that aspect where, Mark, you had mentioned that, the shareholder is part of the stakeholder, and if they view themselves that way, stakeholder inclusivity perhaps becomes more easier and more understandable even to the shareholder. What does that look like practically? How do governing boards achieve stakeholder inclusivity in organizations practically? And Louise has just mentioned how boards should, in their agenda or in their strategic planning, should have this even as part of their planning. How does it look like practically?
Practically, I don't really have any experience in that, but I think it's an absolutely important concept that there should be a strategy or a policy with regard to shareholder interference with the workings of the board. Because don't forget that the board members, right, the directors, not only do they have fiduciary duties for the company on behalf of the company, but also individually in their private capacities, they could be sued. Right? They could be taken to court. And so if you were talking about shadow boards as well, where a director is sitting there and not really contributing, not adding value to the company, which is what the ultimate objective is, inclusive of the stakeholders and the shareholders and everybody else like that, then that particular director of the company is setting himself up for failure. At the end of the day, he could end up in jail because he or she is not aware of the workings of the company as a shadow director. So I think that the concept of having an entrenched policy, entrenched system whereby there is a strategy to address interference from, in the case that you used, Louise, the government minister interfering with the workings of a parastatal. You know, we could use numerous examples. Let's be blunt about it. We know the whole story of AgriBizDev, right? It's out in the papers, and great thing about Namibia is that we have freedom of the press. You can talk about anything in this country. And that's why I truly believe that we are successful. We will be even more successful. It's critical.
Yeah.
So I think that it's probably something that you guys, through the Namibian Institute of Corporate Governance, of which we're a member, need to press companies towards doing. You know, asking, especially the bigger companies, what is your policy towards interference? You know, what are you going to do about it? Do you realize that you're setting yourself up for failure if you allow interference from your shareholder, who in the case of your business being SOEs, is the government? The government is your shareholder. In my case, it's my executives sitting in Vancouver and the board at my head office. So what is your policy as far as that's concerned? Because if you are going to allow that sort of interference, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And I think it's a very good concept that we need to address. And I think it gets brushed under the carpet too easily.
Yes, and I think this is why we have this conversation, so that, you know, the various stakeholders, the boards and shareholders, can actually take cognizance thereof and start to do something in the boardroom about that. And I was talking about, you know, governing boards, and you've said very good points there about policies. And one of the things is definitely policies that boards need to look at. Mercia, there should be other things that the board, you know, has to consider practically in order to attain or to achieve stakeholder inclusivity in an organization. Can you think of any? And I know you've mentioned branding, for instance, and that, for instance, talks to me about communication and stakeholder engagement. So there are those aspects, and there are other aspects, perhaps like sustainable development reporting, integrated reporting, where we report not only to the shareholder as it were in the past, but we now, you know, including other aspects, ESG and so forth. Can you speak to me a little bit about those considerations, those practical things the board has to do?
Yeah, I think I'll maybe just touch on the last question and then touch on some of the additional things that the board has to do in terms of what we do on stakeholder or shareholder management.
Yeah.
So as a listed entity, we have the privilege of having a nice investor services department. We've got corporate communications departments, and we host roadshows at least twice a year where we engage our various shareholders in particular, because if you're listed, you compete for capital, you compete for support from your investors, which are your shareholders, and you've got to make a propelling business case to make sure that they don't just divest, that they actually buy into your strategy, that they buy into your governance, your purpose, and the things that you're trying to achieve. So our investor roadshows are quite important as part of our shareholder management strategy, so that everybody knows, and we don't just meet at the AGM, but twice a year we share our strategy, we share updates on how far we've come in the execution of that strategy and what the organization's vision is, what our reason for existence is. And so we try and engage that shareholder support, so that you don't get activism in a negative way when they're actually trying to force you to be more transparent, to be more reasonable with executive remuneration, but that you're rather proactive as opposed to reactive. So I had one of our directors challenge me significantly on our corporate communications plan and strategy, because she had believed that it was quite a big tool in stakeholder engagement. Yeah. And then ESG, from an environmental, social and governance perspective, has just become so much of a bigger lens that the whole world is looking at. So having proper sustainability policies and this integrated financial report that now requires you to have meaningful conversations with all your stakeholders through this report to society is one of the ways in which we are really held accountable and have to be transparent around it. So policies around how decisions are made, how authority is delegated, and governance is a very, very strong aspect of how the board can help set frameworks in place so that it's quite clear on within what framework things happen. And once you have a clear framework, you've got a guided operating model, and you don't have to charter through grey waters and try and understand where's the risk actually, where's the pitfall. You know clearly what the governance expectations are.
Yeah. And I think there's so many other aspects that, you know, that should be considered. For instance, value creation, sustainable growth, treating all stakeholders equally, and so forth. And obviously on this platform, we don't have enough time to delve into each and every of these categories, but it's good enough that we can mention that there are certain things that can be done pragmatically by the boards or by governing bodies, as we now refer to them, that will enhance stakeholder inclusivity. And we're coming to the end of this, you know, session today. And I just wanted to mention that I made a mistake earlier when I was introducing Mark, and I said Okurusu mine is, you know, Shikoto region, and that was totally, yes, it's also, and that's where Mercia comes from, yes. So I made that mistake, and I quickly want to retract that and correct that. There are definitely no questions, but there are positive comments right now for us. So we just want to go to the last questions that I have for each of you. And this is one question that I would want all of us to just have a look at. You know, one of the ways to restore balance to our economy is by changing corporate practices through shareholder-driven reforms that are designed to increase corporate responsibility. So King 4 stresses and advocates for shareholder activism or advocacy. I think you might have mentioned that, Mercia, and I'll actually start with you. What is this? What is shareholder advocacy, and how do we reconcile it with the shift towards shift from shareholder primacy? Yeah, so what is that concept?
Yeah, I think shareholder primacy is if you really just look at the lens, the financial lens in the organization. And if you measure progress by profit, money is the principal measure of value, cost is the key consideration, for example, in purchase decisions, that is primacy. But if you go to advocacy, it says the organization has a purpose.
Right.
The shareholder has bought into that purpose. Are we actually aligned on how we're going to deliver on that purpose? And the example that I want to give you is something very practical, but totally maybe it relates to the concept, but how I want to paint this picture is that shareholder advocacy is really always asking the question around how do we define value? So it's not the primacy anymore to say value is money, but how do we define value? So let's take a purchasing decision. Say we make a decision to buy a microwave in the house. So the economic lens that you're going to wear is going to say, can we afford it? And which microwave provides the best value for money?
Right.
Then if you look at the environmental consideration, you're going to say, what's the energy consumption? Because you're going to get to a point where you say this microwave uses so much electricity that actually it just remains dormant because the environmental impact is so bad that you're not going to be utilizing it to its maximum. Then there's the aesthetics. How does it look? What is people's perception of it? So if you look at the aesthetics of the microwave, you're saying, is it small enough to fit on the counter? Does it look and feel like all the other equipment in the house? So what's the aesthetics? And that's brand value, if you translate it now into organizational terms. And then there's the relational perspective. So when you buy the microwave, how does it affect the relationships in the household? Will it make us cook and eat together? Yeah. Or will it make everybody just warm their plate of food or quickly cook an egg or whatever you want to and have a meal on your own? So it's really all those lenses that shareholders in their advocacy now weighs. And they're saying, we're not going to be driving one leg of value only, but we're going to be advocating that we align around purpose and that we just make sure that we've got more accountability, transparency, and alignment in delivering on the objectives that all of us have agreed the company loves for or exists for. So that's basically what it is.
Yeah, and I think I quickly want to draw that, comparison between what the board's consideration was, which we spoke about earlier, with, considering the value creation by all stakeholders, and now the shareholder also having a similar thinking in mind and not just thinking about their value in terms of money, but value in terms of other aspects of business and other aspects in terms of community and the social aspects, the environmental aspects.
Yeah.
You mentioned the triple Ps. So literally a holistic view instead of just a one-sided view. And let me ask Louise if you have any views on that.
Thank you. I think Mercia have mentioned most of them, but I think I want to put this shareholder advocacy at the table of the board of directors, because this is not going to happen if the board of directors is not focused and making sure, just like we have a checklist in terms of what are the things that the board should tick. Risk is always at the top of the board of directors, but now stakeholders doesn't make it in the list to say. So I think what it means is that every board meetings, board members must say, this decision, what impact does it have on our intangible asset and our tangible assets? Now, if they cannot see it beyond 3 years or 4, 5 to 10 years, it will mean that decision might have a damage to the sustainability of the company. So therefore, we are saying shareholder must not only make informed decision with a kind of a bigger telescope on the values, on the intangible asset. So we haven't talked much about, for example, employees, because they are part of inclusive stakeholders. We haven't talked, for example, about trade union. If we are not considering these critical stakeholders in the process of how we make decisions, then it's going to affect the business sustainability in the long term. So therefore, what the board could do, firstly, recently I attended an event by NAMRA, where they were giving award to companies that are paying tax. And one of the biggest taxpayers, of course, B2Gold was one of them, and the BIAS. But just a lot of people had the reflection, oh, this company is doing a contribution. But how much is individual businesses in Namibia are advocating in terms of their contribution to society? Because, for example, stakeholder, their contribution to society in terms maybe of tax, of employment creation, of corporate social responsibility, many of our private sectors and probably also public enterprises, we are not so much visible on our corporate social responsibilities, because we live in an ecosystem where if your business is not adding to poverty eradications, is not adding to income inequality in Namibia. That's why NEPAD even adopted inclusive stakeholder, because they say this is an agenda for Africa, because we live too much in poverty, yet we have a lot of capital getting out of our continent. And that is because it's at the center of stakeholders is not recognized, but profit-driven approach to governance. It's more, I think, for me, I think it's a topic we need to explore further and then measure. Because recently, for example, we conducted the survey when we ran a competition for our public entities, which one is complying to corporate governance. And we had stakeholder there, and we only looked at, not in terms of only you have a policy, but we looked at how is your engagement with the media? How was your strategy around negative publicity? How much money are you spending on corporate social? How much platform are you having in social media? That is advocacy. How much engagement between the board of directors and the stakeholders, because usually that is left to executive management to engage stakeholders, but the board should be engaging stakeholders. They should be probably inviting certain stakeholders to the board meetings to do presentations so that they understand the perspective and interest of the stakeholders. So that's what advocacy is all about.
Oh, yeah. So that involves both the board and the shareholder. And Mark, I actually want to divert a little from that question, because Ms. Louise has mentioned a very critical aspect of that, of stakeholder engagement and so on, and the communities and society. And of course, we're talking about ESG generally, but ESG is something that we need to talk about broadly on this Fireplace Conversations, and we need to have a dedicated session to it. So it's definitely planned as part of our discussions. But now I just want to ask you, as somebody who's passionate about communities and so on, what is your take on CSR and CSI, and how should we go about it?
Thanks. That's a very appropriate question for me. I appreciate you asking me, but do you mind if I just respond to what was said about
Please go
advocacy
ahead.
very briefly? Because I just want to add one thing about shareholder advocacy.
Yeah.
I think it's important for everybody to note that shareholders appoint the board to take decisions, right? And obviously you then have the management committee headed by the general manager or the CEO or whatever that implements those decisions. And at the end of the day, shareholder advocacy does not mean the shareholders tell the board what to do. It's very important to make that distinction here.
Yes.
If the shareholders tell the board what to do, and remember the shareholders chose that board, they appointed them to give the direction that they're seeking, that they're looking for in terms of the sort of company that they want. Is it a company that wants profit at any cost? Or is it a company that wants to give back at any cost, while still giving returns to its shareholders, right? So at the end of the day, they've appointed the directors to do the job. And if they're advocating certain actions on behalf of the board, then they're not doing their job. Then that comes back to your question about shareholder interference. Yeah. That's really what I want to say about that, just to add to what Louise said there. As far as social investment is concerned, I think that I've often had discussions with individuals with whom I work in social investment, social responsibility circles about the degree to which a company must invest over and above all the obligatory taxes, royalties, levies that you pay, because those are the rules, the regulations. You know? In our case, 37.5% corporate tax, which is very high. Yeah. On top of that, you got 4% gross tax on gross sales, which is a royalty, 3%, 1% export levy, 4% on your top line, plus 37.5% on your bottom line. And you end up with more than 50% taxes, right? So people have a legitimate argument to say, well, you know, we're giving so much back as it is, just in the form of taxes, because the government's positioned itself actually in this country very well to maximize the effective taxation rate while not deterring investment, right? If you go beyond a certain tipping point, you won't have any investment because you're paying so much tax, you're going to go next door to Zimbabwe or to Angola or wherever else it might be. So they have a legitimate argument saying, why should I do CSI as well?
Right.
And the distinction between CSR and CSI, and I think I'd like to say it here, that I'm pretty convinced that Steve Galloway invented the term CSI, corporate social investment, as opposed to corporate social responsibility. And we've all adopted that. And Steve, by the way, we are probably going to adopt it in my corporate world, B2Gold globally. I've been trying to push for that. And I think the distinction there between responsibility being, you know, you're responsible for doing this, you better do it, otherwise you just don't have a social license to operate. And investment meaning that you invest in the country to make it a better place, right? And you invest because you want to invest in that country. You want to make it a better place. Coming back to an operation that's marginal, it's not making a lot of money, that's already paying all the taxes, even if it doesn't make any profit, it's still paying royalties on the top line. And the argument that people are saying, why should I also give back to society? Why should I give back to the environment, to, in our case, rhinos or something like that? And the point is that you've got to position yourself and consider where you operate. Once again, in our particular sector, the mining sector, you are in the business of consuming a resource that is non-renewable, that is actually on loan to you, right? In other words, it is the people of Namibia, as administered by the government of Namibia in our particular case, that has given you the right to utilize that resource to the maximum benefit of the country and its people. Okay, so if the maximum benefit of the country and its people is not just taxes that go to centralized coffers, you know, the treasury, but also it's the local communities, it's the local environment, it's the whole ESG thing that's become the key word, the buzzwords, everybody's using that right now. Yeah. Then that gives you relevance to do that as well. It's not good enough to just give to the government, right, to the central institution, where then it gets dissipated to whatever the government needs to do to run its business, to run the country effectively. So I have the argument that, you know, I was running a very marginal company. Okarusu was always very marginal. Some years we made big profits, some years we made losses, because the industrial minerals business, whether it doesn't matter which mineral it is under enormous pressure from competition, right? So if you suddenly discover a big graphite deposit, the world's graphite producers will flood the market with graphite and drive the price down to make sure that you stay shut. But even in that environment, we managed to create a very significant social investment arm, and we managed to establish our relevance in society and the respect that we need in order to operate on behalf of the government, on behalf of the communities, on behalf of the people and all of our stakeholders. Now I'm in charge of a company that's making what some people call immoral profits, right? And those immoral profits used to be applied to the diamond business, but now it's applied to gold as well. From a very low-grade mine, we're making very good profits. And we're giving back, as you saw from the awards ceremony, a very large chunk of that to the government in terms of obligatory funding, taxes, royalties, corporate taxes and levies and things like that. But we're also giving a huge amount back over and above that because that is the ethos of our company. Our ethos globally is about, our CEO, Clive Johnson, always talks about fairness, accountability, respect and transparency. Those are our key words that we use in every single engagement with stakeholders, with the public. And I've just come back from Vancouver last week. In our AGM, our CEO spoke about that being our driving force. And I think as far as the shareholders are concerned, if that is the value system that they want to impart upon the directors, the board of the company, then they should choose the individuals in the board that really believe in those values, right? Those 4 values that I mentioned there. And once they've appointed those directors to actually carry out their desire, absolutely to maximize the value of the resource, in our case, but also to maximize the benefit of the country, to give back as much as possible. We say we take from the earth, but we give back more to the earth. And that's where, in my opinion, there's no excuse to not have a social investment arm. You've got to have it, no matter how marginal your company is. It's all about relevance. You're not going to be relevant. Coming back to what I said a little bit earlier about Mervyn King, looking at studying, when I think he wrote his first King Code, what was it about these companies that are fabulously successful over continuously of all the years? And it's just one common denominator, and that is that they give back.
And giving back, and we're running thin with time, but giving back in very quickly, Mark, what you talked about CSI, and you're definitely passionate about that distinction between CSI and sponsorship. Do you find a difference there?
Look, I think sponsorship can also be CSI, but CSI has to be sustainable. Right. Just this morning, I flew back from the mine. I'm based in Windhoek, but I was there to work with the World Food Programme. Would you believe it? We had all the directors of the World Food Programme with us today, and they've seen that we're very successful in agriculture. I see there was an article in the newspaper about why is B2Gold getting involved in agriculture. Leave that to the farmers. You're given the mine, given the resource to mine, carry on with that. But I think that one has to look at whatever the opportunities are within your country. We're involved in agriculture because we want 100% of our profits from agriculture to go back to communities, to go back into the environment, to make it sustainable. So you can't have a donation, you give somebody money like giving a fish as opposed to teaching a fish that is sustainable. So sponsorships or donations have a place for sure, as long as they're sustainable. Right. What we did just this morning, we had a meeting at FNB RMB, and maybe I shouldn't mention them because it's like advertising. Apparently, I'm not allowed to. But we mentioned one of the orphanages that we're supporting up in the north, in the Amasati region, called Nakayale, and this was FNB RMB calling for support, calling for us to present about this, and because we're the largest benefactor towards this in a sustainable way. We wanted to make sure that whatever funding we get for the children in the orphanage doesn't just disappear when they go to high school. And we've managed to do that. FNB RMB came up with that.
Okay, so just as a remark from my side, from the corporate governance side, is that sponsorship is obviously inward looking. It's looking to bring some sort of reward to the company, return on investment and so on. And CSI looks outward. It's looking at that value creation that you're talking about, sort of selfless aspect of the business arm. And I think that obviously you need a session to really just go into this. And we've come to an abrupt end to our session because we don't have so much time. And, I always wish that this can go on and on and on, and the discussions can go on and on. Our viewers are finding value in this. In fact, somebody just said that it's an excellent session, great moderation and panel. Too bad time is always, a bit short, and I always also lament on that. But It was so good to have all of you and to have your wisdom on these aspects of corporate governance, which are very pertinent, and in these shifting times, which have become very prominent in corporate governance. And you know, the people listening, I hope the right people are listening. I hope the shareholders are listening. And I hope the board of directors are listening, and so that we can start to implement and achieve stakeholder inclusivity, because it's beneficial not only for stakeholders that are not shareholders, but also for shareholders, which are also stakeholders, and for the society at large and for the country generally. So thank you, Ms. Louise, for coming.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mercia. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate the time with you. It was good, but it was just so short. But yeah, I hope to do another session with you again. Thank you, and thank you to the viewers that are listening. Thank you for tuning in again. Please tune in again next week. We have a really interesting session next week. You don't want to miss that one. And just stay attuned with us on our social media pages, and you'll get to see what we're talking about next week. And yeah, good evening to everybody. Thank you. Yes.